The town had chained the giant horse in the abandoned barn because his blood-red eyes promised violence. But when James Rutherford stepped inside, what he heard made him freeze. The massive creature wasn't growling, he was crying. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The county fairgrounds sat at the edge of town like a forgotten relic, its rusted gates groaning in the wind that swept across the empty fields. Most people avoided the place after sunset, when shadows stretched long and the old livestock barns creaked with memories of better days. But it wasn't the decay that kept folks away anymore. It was the horse. They called him Titan, though nobody knew his real name or where he'd come from. What they did know was that he'd appeared 3 months ago in the largest barn, chained to the reinforced walls with heavy iron links that clanked and rattled whenever he moved. The sound carried across the fairgrounds like a death knell, and the locals had learned to recognize it, to quicken their steps when they heard it, to cross themselves and hurry on their way. The stories spread faster than wildfire through the small town of Millbrook. Some said the horse had killed a man in a neighboring county, trampling him to death in a fit of rage. Others whispered that he'd been used in illegal fighting rings, trained to be vicious, to attack on command. The most dramatic tales claimed he was cursed, possessed by something dark and terrible that lurked behind those blood-red eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness of the barn. Sarah Mitchell heard all the stories as she restocked shelves at the general store where she worked. She'd listened to the customers' gossip, their voices dropping to hushed tones when they spoke of the chained giant. They'd describe how the horse's eyes burned like hot coals, how his massive hooves could crush a man's skull, how the chains were the only thing standing between the town and disaster. The local sheriff had posted warnings around the fairgrounds, and the owner of the property, a distant corporation that had inherited the land, had hired someone to throw feed over the barn door twice a day without ever going inside. Nobody wanted to get close enough to see what the horse might do if given the chance. James Rutherford heard the stories too, though he paid them little mind. At 62 years old, with a Purple Heart gathering dust in a drawer and a leg that ached whenever rain was coming, James had learned that fear often dressed up as fact. He'd seen real monsters in his 3 tours overseas, had looked into eyes that held genuine malice, and he knew the difference between danger and misunderstanding. He'd returned to Millbrook 5 years ago after his wife passed and the city felt too loud, too full of memories he couldn't escape. The small town had welcomed him quietly, the way small towns do, and he'd settled into a modest house on Oak Street with a small pension and a garden that kept his hands busy. His neighbors knew he was a veteran, knew he walked with a slight limp and rarely talked about the war, and they respected his privacy. James first heard about Titan from his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd stopped by with a casserole and a warning. The old woman had clutched her sweater tight around her shoulders as she spoke, her eyes wide with concern. She'd told him to stay away from the fairgrounds, especially after dark, and had described the horse in such vivid detail that James found himself curious despite her warnings. That evening, after Mrs. Patterson left and the sun began its descent behind the hills, James stood on his porch and looked toward the fairgrounds. He could just make out the silhouette of the old barns against the darkening sky, could almost imagine he heard the distant rattle of chains carried on the wind. Something in his chest tightened, a familiar feeling he'd learned to trust during his years in service. Intuition, his sergeant had called it. The ability to sense when something wasn't quite right, when the official story didn't match the truth on the ground. The next morning, James drove his old pickup truck to the fairgrounds. The gates were chained shut, but they hung loose enough that he could slip through on foot. He walked slowly, his cane tapping against the packed earth, taking in the abandoned Midway with its empty ticket booths and silent rides. The place had an eerie quality in the morning light, like a carnival frozen in time. The barn was easy to find. It loomed larger than the others, its red paint faded to rust. its doors marked with warning signs that screamed danger in bold letters. James could hear movement inside, the scrape of hooves against concrete, the heavy breathing of a large animal, but more than that, he could hear something else. A sound that made him pause, that made his weathered face soften with recognition. The horse was crying. Not the way horses typically sound when distressed, but something deeper, more profound. It was the sound of grief, of despair, of a creature that had given up hope. James had heard similar sounds before, in field hospitals and prison camps, in the voices of soldiers who'd seen too much and lost too much and couldn't find their way back to the light. It was a sound that bypassed logic and spoke directly to the soul, and James felt it resonate in his bones. He approached the barn door carefully, not out of fear but out of respect. Whatever was inside deserved to be approached with dignity, not caution born of gossip and assumption. The heavy wooden door was partially ajar, and through the gap, James could see shadows moving in the dim interior. He could smell hay and manure, could hear the steady clank of chains, could sense the presence of something massive waiting in the darkness. Taking a breath, James pushed the door open wider, letting morning light spill into the barn. And there, in the far corner, he saw Titan for the first time. The horse was enormous, standing at least 18 hands high, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb the light around it. Heavy chains wrapped around his legs and neck, attached to iron rings bolted into the concrete walls. His head hung low, his magnificent body covered in dirt and old scars. But it was the eyes that stopped James cold. They weren't red with malice or evil. They were red from crying, from exhaustion, from the kind of prolonged suffering that breaks the spirit long before it breaks the body. James stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still resting on the weathered wood, his heart hammering in his chest with a recognition that transcended words. He'd seen those eyes before, though never in a horse. He'd seen them in the mirror during the darkest months after the war, when nightmares kept him awake and the weight of survival pressed down like a physical thing. He'd seen them in the faces of brothers in arms who came home in body but left their souls somewhere in the desert sand. The horse didn't react to his presence at first. Titan remained motionless in the corner, head bowed, chains hanging heavy from his massive frame. The only sound was his labored breathing and the occasional clink of metal against concrete when he shifted his weight. James noticed how thin the horse was beneath that powerful build, how his ribs showed through the dirt-matted coat, how his legs trembled with the effort of simply standing. Moving slowly, James stepped fully into the barn and let the door swing shut behind him. The sound echoed in the cavernous space, and finally, Titan raised his head. Those bloodshot eyes fixed on James with an intensity that would have sent most people running. But James held his ground, meeting that gaze with the same steady calm he'd learned to project in the face of danger. He discovered long ago that panic was contagious, but so was peace. "Easy now," James said quietly, his voice carrying across the space between them without rising above a conversational tone. "I'm not here to hurt you." The words felt inadequate, almost foolish to say to an animal, but James had learned that tone mattered more than vocabulary. He'd seen combat dogs respond to the gentleness in a handler's voice, had watched wild creatures calm when approached with genuine respect rather than fear. Titan's ears flicked forward, the first sign of awareness James had seen. The horse was listening, processing, trying to understand if this human represented another threat or something different. James could see the tension in those powerful muscles, could see how the horse positioned himself for either fight or flight, despite the chains that made both impossible. Whatever had happened to this creature, it had taught him that humans brought pain. James took another step forward, moving with deliberate slowness. His cane tapped softly against the concrete, a steady rhythm that announced his approach without aggression. He kept his body language open, non-threatening, much like the techniques he'd learned for approaching wounded soldiers who didn't know friend from foe anymore. Some things he'd discovered were universal across species. Fear recognized fear. Kindness recognized kindness. The horse watched him come, and James could see the internal battle playing out behind those red-rimmed eyes. Every instinct probably screamed at Titan to rear back, to lash out, to defend himself against this stranger entering his prison. But there was also something else there. Something James recognized because he'd felt it himself in his darkest moments. A tiny, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally come who understood. James stopped about 10 feet away, far enough to give the horse space, but close enough to truly see him. Up close, the extent of Titan's suffering became painfully clear. The chains had rubbed raw patches on his legs where the metal pressed against skin and bone. Old scars crisscrossed his body, some from obvious abuse, others from what looked like failed attempts to break free. His hooves were overgrown and cracked, his mane tangled with burrs and debris, his entire being a testament to prolonged neglect. But more than the physical wounds, James could see the psychological damage. The way Titan held himself spoke of broken trust, of a spirit that had been systematically crushed by cruelty and isolation. This wasn't a dangerous horse. This was a desperate one. There was a profound difference, though James knew most people couldn't see it. They looked at the size, the chains, the bloodshot eyes, and saw a monster. James looked at the same things and saw a prisoner of war. He'd worked with soldiers suffering from what they now called PTSD, though in his day they'd had different names for it. Shell shock, combat fatigue, battle stress. Whatever the label, the core remained the same. Something terrible had happened, something that shattered the fundamental sense of safety and trust, and the mind built walls to survive. Those walls kept the pain in, but they also kept connection out, leaving the sufferer isolated in a prison of their own protective instincts. Looking at Titan, James saw the same pattern. The horse had built walls, had learned that humans meant pain, had shut down emotionally to survive whatever hell he'd endured. The chains were real, yes, but the invisible ones were stronger. Even if someone removed the physical restraints, Titan was trapped by trauma, by learned helplessness, by the belief that fighting back only brought more suffering. James lowered himself carefully onto an overturned bucket near the wall, his leg grateful for the rest even as his mind remained focused on the horse. He didn't try to approach further, didn't reach out or make demands. He simply sat, breathing calmly, letting his presence become familiar rather than threatening. It was a technique he'd learned from a therapist at the VA hospital, this concept of being present without requiring anything in return. Sometimes, she'd told him, the most powerful thing you can offer someone in pain is simply to witness it without judgment. So James sat and watched, and Titan stood and watched back, and between them stretched a silence that held more communication than words ever could. The morning sun crept higher, sending shafts of light through gaps in the barn walls, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Outside, the world continued its normal rhythm, but inside this forgotten barn, time seemed to slow, to bend around the weight of two damaged souls recognizing each other across the divide of species. Minutes passed, then an hour, and James remained on his makeshift seat, patient in a way that only age and experience could teach. His leg throbbed with its familiar ache, a barometer of old injuries that never quite healed, but he ignored it. Pain was an old companion, one he'd learned to live with, to acknowledge without letting it control him. He suspected Titan understood pain in the same intimate way, had made the same uneasy peace with suffering as a constant presence. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Titan's rigid stance began to soften. His ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull in defensive aggression, relaxed slightly. His weight shifted from the tense readiness of fight or flight to something marginally less vigilant. James recognized these micro changes because he'd learned to read them in himself, had spent years learning to identify the subtle shifts between hypervigilance and actual presence in the moment. "You've been alone a long time, haven't you?" James said softly, not expecting an answer, but feeling the need to fill the silence with something gentle. The sound of his voice seemed to settle into the space between them, like a bridge being built plank by plank. "They brought you here and chained you up, and everyone decided you were dangerous without ever asking why you were afraid." The horse's ears swiveled toward him at the sound, tracking James's voice with the focused attention of someone starved for connection. James continued speaking, keeping his tone low and even, telling Titan about his own journey. He talked about the war, about nights when the darkness felt alive with threats, about how hard it had been to trust anyone after coming home. He spoke of his wife, Margaret, who'd had the patience to sit with him through the nightmares, who never demanded he be the man he was before, but loved the man he'd become. "I know what it's like," James said, his voice roughening with emotion. "To have everyone look at you and see something dangerous, something broken, something to be kept at arm's length. They see the scars and the anger, and they think that's all you are. They don't see what happened to make you that way. They don't ask what you needed that you never got." Titan took a step forward. Just one, the chains clanking with the movement, but it was movement toward James rather than away, and that made all the difference. James felt his breath catch, felt hope bloom in his chest like a flower pushing through concrete. He remained still, not wanting to spook this fragile moment of trust with any sudden gesture. The horse stopped after that single step, as if testing the waters, seeing if this human would react with violence or demands or any of the 1,000 ways people had probably responded before. But James just smiled, a small, genuine expression of encouragement that crinkled the corners of his weathered eyes. "That's right," he said softly. "You decide. I'm not here to force anything from you. I'm just here to sit with you for a while, if that's all right." Something in Titan's posture shifted again, a softening that went deeper than the previous changes. His head lowered slightly, not in submission, but in something closer to acceptance. James could see the exhaustion in every line of the horse's body, the weariness that came from constant vigilance, from never being able to let down your guard because safety was a luxury you'd learn not to expect. Time continued its slow march, and James found himself talking about other things. He told Titan about his garden, about the tomatoes he was trying to grow and the rabbits that kept eating his lettuce. He described the view from his porch at sunset, the way the light turned the hills gold and made him remember that beauty still existed in the world. He talked about Mrs. Patterson's casseroles and how she meant well even when she worried too much, about the way the town came together for the annual harvest festival, about all the small, ordinary details of a life lived quietly. And as he spoke, something remarkable happened. Titan took another step, then another, until he stood just a few feet away from James. The horse's massive head hung at James's level, those bloodshot eyes studying him with an intensity that felt almost human in its intelligence. James could see himself reflected in those dark pupils, could see how small and vulnerable he looked from the horse's perspective, and he wondered if Titan saw the same thing in reverse, if the horse recognized his own vulnerability mirrored in this scarred old man. Slowly, moving with the same careful deliberation he'd use approaching a loaded weapon, James extended his hand, not reaching out to touch, not making demands, just offering. His palm up, fingers relaxed, hand steady, despite the tremor that sometimes affected him these days. It was an invitation without pressure, a question without requiring an answer. Titan stared at that outstretched hand for a long moment. James could practically see the war happening behind those eyes, the battle between instinct and hope, between the lessons of pain and the desperate desire for connection. Every muscle in the horse's body tensed, preparing for betrayal, for the violence that surely must follow any gesture of openness. But James waited, his hand steady, his breathing calm, his entire being radiating a patience that said he had all the time in the world, that there was no rush, no expectation, no demand for trust that hadn't been earned. And finally, after what felt like an eternity compressed into moments, Titan moved his head forward. Inch by careful inch, the horse's nose approached James's hand, his breath hot and rapid with anxiety, his entire body trembling with the effort of overcoming fear. When Titan's velvet muzzle finally touched James's palm, the contact was feather-light, barely there, as if the horse expected the hand to transform into a weapon at any second. James held perfectly still, letting Titan control every aspect of the interaction, letting the horse investigate on his own terms. The warm breath against his skin, the slight moisture from the horse's nose, the whisper-soft touch of whiskers, all of it spoke to a courage James found humbling. This magnificent creature, so thoroughly betrayed by humans, was choosing to try again. "Good boy," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion he didn't bother to hide. "You're so brave, Titan, so incredibly brave." The words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what was happening, for the bridge being built between two beings who'd both learned that trust was dangerous, that opening yourself to another invited only pain. Yet here they were, choosing connection anyway, choosing hope in the face of every lesson that said hope was foolish. Titan didn't pull away immediately. He stood there, nose pressed against James's hand, breathing in the scent of this strange human who spoke with gentleness and moved without threat. James could feel the horse's entire body vibrating with tension, could sense how much effort it took to maintain this contact, to not bolt backward into the false safety of isolation. It reminded him of his first session with his therapist at the VA, how sitting in that office had felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, how every instinct screamed at him to run, while a tiny voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, letting someone in might save his life. Minutes passed in this frozen tableau, man and horse connected by the smallest of touches that carried the weight of worlds. Then slowly, James moved his hand. Not much, just enough to let his fingers gently stroke the side of Titan's muzzle, a whisper of contact that asked permission with every millimeter. The horse's eyes widened, showing white around the edges, but he didn't pull away. That trembling intensified, running through the massive body like an earthquake contained within flesh and bone. James continued the gentle stroking, his movements slow and predictable, telegraphing his intentions so clearly that even in his traumatized state, Titan could process what was happening without feeling ambushed. This was something James had learned through hard experience, both with his own recovery and with the animals he'd encountered over the years. Predictability was safety. Consistency was trust. When the world had proven itself chaotic and cruel, the smallest reliable kindness became an anchor. As James's fingers traced the soft hair along Titan's jaw, he felt something wet drop onto his hand. Looking up, he saw tears streaming from the horse's eyes, cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. Those bloodshot eyes that everyone feared, that seemed to glow with malevolence in the dim barn light, were simply eyes that had cried too much, that had seen too much, that belonged to a soul in agony. "Oh, buddy," James said, his own eyes burning with sympathetic tears. I know it hurts. I know you're tired of hurting." His other hand came up slowly, and now he was cradling Titan's great head between both palms, feeling the solid warmth of living bone beneath soft skin, feeling the life that pulsed there despite everything that had tried to extinguish it. Titan's knees buckled slightly as if the weight of being seen, truly seen for what he was rather than what people feared, was too much to bear while standing. James shifted his own position, ignoring the protest from his bad leg, positioning himself so the horse could lean into him without collapsing entirely. And lean Titan did, resting his considerable weight against this frail human who somehow understood, who looked at him and saw past the chains and the scars to the terrified, heartbroken creature underneath. They stayed like that for a long time, man and horse locked in an embrace that transcended species, united by the common language of trauma and survival. James felt Titan's hot tears soak into his shirt, felt the great shuddering breaths that spoke of emotions too large to contain, and he recognized every bit of it. He'd cried like that once, had broken down completely in Margaret's arms after a particularly brutal nightmare had let out years of stored anguish in great, tearing sobs that left him hollowed out and somehow lighter. "You're not alone anymore," James promised, speaking into the horse's ear so softly the words were almost thought rather than sound. "I see you. I see what they did to you, and I see who you really are underneath all that pain. You're not a monster. You never were. You're just hurt, and that's different. That's something we can work with." The morning had aged into afternoon without James noticing, and his body was starting to register complaints about the awkward position, the hard concrete floor, the strain on muscles that weren't as young as they used to be. But he didn't move, wouldn't have moved for anything, because Titan needed this moment more than James needed comfort. This was triage, the same kind he'd performed on countless occasions in the field, except instead of stopping bleeding or stabilizing fractures, he was trying to stop emotional hemorrhaging, trying to stabilize a spirit that had nearly shattered completely. Eventually, Titan pulled back slightly, not breaking contact entirely, but creating enough space to look at James properly. Those red-rimmed eyes studied him with a new quality, something sharper than the dull acceptance James had seen earlier. It was assessment, yes, but also something like wonder, as if the horse couldn't quite believe this was real, that someone had finally come who understood the difference between dangerous and suffering. James knew he couldn't stay in the barn forever, though part of him wanted to. His leg had gone numb from the awkward position, and he could feel the deep ache settling into his bones that would make tomorrow morning a painful affair. But more importantly, Titan needed more than just emotional comfort. The horse needed food, water, medical attention, and above all, he needed those chains removed. The physical restraints were bad enough, but James understood that leaving them on sent a message, reinforced the idea that Titan was something to be contained rather than someone to be helped. With slow, deliberate movements, James stood, his knee popping audibly in the quiet barn. Titan's head jerked up at the sound, ears flattening momentarily before relaxing again when James remained calm. "I have to go for a bit," James explained, maintaining eye contact with the horse, speaking as he would to a frightened patient. "But I'm coming back. I promise you I'm coming back with help. You understand? I'm not leaving you here like this." Something in Titan's expression shifted, a flicker of what might have been panic. The horse took a step forward, chains rattling as if trying to follow. The sound cut through James like a blade, the desperation in that simple movement almost breaking his resolve. He reached out again, resting his hand on Titan's neck, feeling the rapid heartbeat beneath his palm. "I know," he said softly. "I know you don't want to be alone, but if I'm going to help you properly, I need supplies. I need to make some calls. Can you trust me for a few hours?" Titan's breath came in sharp, anxious bursts, his nostrils flaring wide. James stood there, hand steady on the horse's neck, pouring every ounce of certainty he possessed into that contact. He'd made promises before to soldiers under his command, to his wife in her final days, and he'd kept them all even when it cost him. This promise would be no different. "A few hours," he repeated. "That's all. Then I'm back, and we're going to make things better." With visible effort, James stepped away, breaking the physical connection but maintaining eye contact as he backed toward the barn door. Titan watched him go, every muscle tense, head raised high despite the weight of the chains. The horse didn't make a sound, but his eyes tracked James's every movement, and in them James saw a plea so profound it transcended language. "Don't abandon me. Don't be like all the others." "I won't," James said aloud, even though he was already halfway to the door. "I won't abandon you, Titan, that's a promise." Then he slipped through the opening and into the bright afternoon sunlight that felt almost aggressive after the dim intimacy of the barn. He didn't look back. Couldn't look back, because if he saw Titan standing there alone with those chains and those pleading eyes, he might not have the strength to leave at all. The walk back to his truck felt longer than the journey in. James's mind raced with plans, with obstacles he'd need to overcome, with the sheer magnitude of what he was attempting. He wasn't naive. He knew that helping Titan wouldn't be as simple as removing chains and offering kindness. The horse had been traumatized, possibly for years, and recovery from that kind of damage didn't happen overnight. James knew that from personal experience. He still had nightmares, still had days when the world felt too loud and too bright, and too full of threats that nobody else could see. But he also knew that recovery was possible, that with patience and proper support, even the most damaged soul could find their way back to something resembling peace. He'd done it himself, with Margaret's help and the therapist at the VA and the slow, grinding work of choosing to heal even when staying broken felt easier. If he could do it, then so could Titan. The species didn't matter. Pain was pain, and healing was healing. By the time James reached his truck, he'd formulated the beginning of a plan. First, he needed to find out who legally owned Titan and the property. The corporation, probably some faceless entity that had inherited the fairgrounds and wanted nothing to do with managing it. That might work in his favor. If they saw the horse as a liability, they might be willing to sign ownership over to someone willing to take responsibility. James had his pension and some savings. He could afford to care for a horse, especially if he found a good veterinarian willing to work with him on payment plans. Second, he needed supplies immediately. Food, proper hay, clean water, basic grooming tools, and most urgently, bolt cutters strong enough to remove those chains. He couldn't wait for legal paperwork to get Titan out of those restraints. Every hour the horse spent chained was another hour of psychological damage, another message that he was dangerous, that he deserved to be contained. James had spent enough time in his own mental chains to know how quickly they became part of your identity, how you started to believe you deserved them. Third, and perhaps most complicated, he needed to change the town's perception of Titan. Fear was a powerful thing, and once a community decided something was dangerous, that belief became self-reinforcing. Every time Titan rattled his chains in distress, people would interpret it as aggression. Every time he showed signs of trauma, they'd see proof of his violent nature. James would need to show them what he'd seen, help them understand that the monster they feared was actually a victim crying out for help. The drive to the hardware store took 15 minutes, but James's mind was already back in that barn, with that magnificent creature who'd somehow found the courage to trust again, despite every reason not to. He thought about Titan's tears, about the way the horse had leaned into him, about that desperate step forward when James had tried to leave. Those weren't the actions of a vicious animal. They were the actions of someone drowning who'd finally spotted a lifeline. At the hardware store, James moved with purpose through the aisles, gathering bolt cutters, work gloves, and heavy-duty wire brushes for cleaning away the rust and grime. The young clerk at the counter, a kid named Tommy who couldn't have been more than 19, eyed the purchases with curiosity. "Big project, Mr. Rutherford?" he asked, scanning items across the register. James paused, considering how much to reveal. Sometimes the truth served better than evasion, especially in a small town where secrets rarely stayed buried. "I'm helping that horse out at the fairgrounds," James said plainly, watching Tommy's expression shift from curious to alarmed. "The one they've got chained up. He's not what people think he is." The clerk's hand froze halfway to the next item, his eyes widening with the kind of fear that came from repeated exposure to frightening stories. Mr. Rutherford, that horse is dangerous. My uncle said it attacked someone over in Cedar County, killed a handler. You shouldn't go near it." James met the young man's gaze steadily, seeing in Tommy's face the same certainty that had condemned Titan without trial or evidence. "Your uncle hear that firsthand? Or is it a friend of a friend story?" he asked gently. Tommy's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Well, I mean, everybody knows about it. The stories are all over town." James nodded slowly, taking the bag of purchases Tommy had finally finished ringing up. "That's the problem with stories, son. They get bigger in the telling. I was with that horse for 3 hours this morning. You know what he did? He cried. He's not dangerous. He's traumatized." The word hung in the air between them, clinical and specific, carrying weight that simple descriptors like mean or aggressive couldn't match. Tommy looked uncomfortable, the way people often did when confronted with nuance in a situation they'd already decided was black and white. "Just be careful, okay?" the clerk finally said, and James could hear genuine concern beneath the skepticism. "I will," James promised, "but that horse needs someone to be careful for him, not just of him." From the hardware store, James drove to the farm supply outlet on the edge of town, where he loaded his truck with premium hay, bags of grain, and supplements designed for horses recovering from malnutrition. The owner, Bill Henderson, a weathered man in his 60s who'd run the store for 30 years, helped James load everything into the truck bed without comment. But as James was about to climb into the driver's seat, Bill spoke up. "This for the fairgrounds horse?" James turned, ready to defend his decision, but Bill's expression held no judgment, only thoughtfulness. "Yes," James said simply. Bill nodded, leaning against the truck. "I saw that horse when they first brought him in, you know. Watched them chain him up like he was some kind of monster. But I've been around horses my whole life, and what I saw that day wasn't aggression. It was fear, pure, absolute terror." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Horse doesn't act like that without reason. Something bad happened to him before he got here." James felt a rush of gratitude for this unexpected ally. "That's exactly what I think," he said. "I'm going to try to help him, but it's going to take time and patience." Bill straightened, fishing a business card from his pocket and pressing it into James's hand. "My daughter's a veterinarian. Sarah Henderson practices over in Riverside. She specializes in trauma cases, works with rescue animals mostly. Give her a call, mention I sent you. She might be willing to come take a look, maybe offer you a discount on the bills." The gesture hit James harder than expected. This small act of kindness from a near stranger who'd chosen to see past the town's collective fear. "Thank you," James managed, his voice rough. "This means more than you know." Bill waved off the gratitude with a calloused hand. "That horse deserves a chance, same as any living thing. You're doing right by him. Just don't let the fearmongers in town give you too much grief. Some people prefer their monsters to stay monstrous because it's simpler than admitting they might have been wrong." Armed with supplies and a veterinarian's contact information, James made one more stop at his house to grab additional items. Clean towels, antiseptic ointment, a camping lantern for better visibility in the dim barn, and his old military sleeping bag. If Titan had a rough night, James wanted to be there, wanted the horse to wake up and see that the promise of return had been kept. He'd slept in worse places than a barn floor, and comfort seemed like a small price to pay for rebuilding trust. Mrs. Patterson appeared on her porch as James was loading the last of the supplies, her sharp eyes taking in the hay bales and equipment visible in the truck bed. "James Rutherford, don't tell me you're going back to that horse," she called out, concern etched in every line of her face. James walked over to the property line between their yards, wanting to address her worry directly, rather than simply dismissing it. "I am," he said gently, "and I'm going to help him, Mrs. Patterson. He's not what everyone thinks." She shook her head, wringing her hands in the way she did when particularly agitated. "But the stories, James. Everyone says he's killed people, that he's vicious and unpredictable. What if something happens to you? Who's going to know? Who's going to help if that beast turns on you?" The fear in her voice was genuine, born from caring rather than malice, and James softened his response accordingly. "I appreciate your concern, I truly do. But I've looked that horse in the eye and I know what I saw. He's hurt, not evil. And if I don't help him, who will?" Mrs. Patterson studied him for a long moment, her weathered face creased with worry, but also something else, perhaps recognition of the determination she'd seen in him before. "You always were stubborn," she said finally, a hint of resigned affection in her tone. "Just like with those boys you brought home from the war, the ones everyone said couldn't be helped. You wouldn't listen then either." James smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "And most of them are doing fine now," he reminded her gently. "Sometimes people just need someone to believe in them when they can't believe in themselves." She sighed, her resistance crumbling in the face of his quiet conviction. "At least take my phone number programmed into your cell phone," she insisted, "and call me every few hours so I know you're all right. If I don't hear from you by 9 tonight, I'm sending the sheriff out there." James agreed, knowing it was the compromise she needed to accept his decision, and also knowing that having someone aware of his whereabouts wasn't the worst safety precaution. He jotted down his promise to check in, then climbed into his truck before she could raise further objections. The drive back to the fairgrounds felt different than the morning journey. Then, he'd been curious, drawn by intuition and the nagging sense that the town's fear had obscured truth. Now, he traveled with purpose, with supplies and plans and the weight of a promise made to a suffering creature who'd taken an enormous risk in trusting him. The afternoon sun slanted across the fields, painting everything in golden light that made the world seem gentler than it was, and James found himself rehearsing what he'd say to Titan, how he'd explain each action before taking it so the horse wouldn't feel ambushed. When he pulled up to the fairgrounds, the familiar rattle of chains echoed from within the barn, and James's heart clenched at the sound. He grabbed the bolt cutters first, tucking them into his belt, then hefted a water bucket and some grain. The other supplies could wait. Priority 1 was making sure Titan knew he'd come back as promised, and priority 2 was getting those damned chains off. The barn door stood slightly ajar from his earlier exit, and James pushed it open slowly, announcing his presence with a low whistle. Titan's head swung toward the sound immediately, ears pricked forward, and James saw something in the horse's expression that made his throat tight with emotion. Relief. Pure, unmistakable relief that he hadn't been abandoned after all. "Hey there, buddy," James said softly, setting down the bucket and grain. "Told you I'd come back." Titan took several steps forward, chains clanking with each movement, until he stood close enough for James to feel the horse's breath on his face. There was an urgency in the way Titan pressed his muzzle against James's shoulder, a desperation that spoke of the hours spent waiting, wondering if this had been just another cruel trick, another human who promised kindness only to deliver more abandonment. James wrapped his arms around Titan's neck, feeling the solid warmth of living muscle beneath his hands. "I know," he murmured. "I know waiting is hard, but I'm here now, and I brought everything we need to make things better." He pulled back enough to look Titan in the eye, making sure he had the horse's full attention. "I'm going to remove your chains now," he explained, speaking clearly and calmly. "I need to touch them, need to cut through the metal. It's going to make loud noises and the metal might snap suddenly. But I promise I'm not hurting you. I'm freeing you. Can you trust me to do that?" Titan's ears swiveled, processing the tone if not the exact words, and though tension rippled through his body, he didn't pull away. James started with the chain around Titan's front left leg, the one that showed the most wear damage to the skin beneath. He ran his hand along the metal first, letting Titan feel the contact through layers of sensation, preparing him for what was coming. Then he positioned the bolt cutters, took a breath, and applied pressure. The metal resisted, then gave with a sharp crack that echoed through the barn like a gunshot. Titan flinched violently, his entire body jerking backward, but James had anticipated the reaction and moved with him, keeping one hand on the horse's shoulder, maintaining that physical connection that said he was still there, still safe. "Easy, easy," James soothed, waiting for Titan's breathing to slow before approaching the next chain. "That's the worst part, just that noise. But look, see? One chain is gone already. You're that much closer to free." He held up the severed link for Titan to see, letting the horse examine this evidence that the restraints could indeed be removed, that they weren't permanent fixtures of his existence. Encouraged by the first success, James moved to the next chain. This one wrapped around Titan's rear leg. Again, he telegraphed every movement, explained what he was doing, waited for permission in the form of Titan's acquiescence before proceeding. The second cut went smoother, Titan bracing himself for the noise but not panicking when it came. The third chain, looped around the horse's neck like a medieval collar, took longer because James's hands shook with anger at whoever had thought this level of restraint was necessary or humane. When the neck chain finally fell away, clattering to the concrete floor, Titan shuddered from head to hoof, a full-body tremor that spoke of release so profound it bordered on overwhelming. James steadied him with both hands, feeling the earthquake of emotion rolling through the massive frame. "You're doing great," he encouraged. "Just one more, buddy. One more and you're completely free." The final chain wrapped around Titan's right rear leg, and James could see where it had rubbed the skin raw, creating angry welts that would need immediate attention once the metal was removed. He worked carefully, positioning the cutters to avoid any contact with the damaged flesh, taking his time despite the urgency he felt to get this last restraint off. Titan stood remarkably still, as if understanding that this final indignity was being undone, that freedom was just one loud crack away. When the bolt cutters severed that last chain and it fell to the floor with a definitive clang, the change in Titan was immediate and profound. The horse stood frozen for several heartbeats, as if unable to believe the weight was truly gone, that after all this time the chains had finally released their hold. Then slowly, tentatively, Titan took a step forward, then another. His movements were uncertain, like someone relearning to walk after a long confinement, but there was also wonder in them, a rediscovery of what it meant to move without metal dragging at every limb. James watched with tears streaming down his face, not bothering to hide the emotion that overwhelmed him. He'd seen many powerful moments in his life, births and deaths and the desperate courage of soldiers under fire, but something about watching Titan take those first free steps hit him in a place beyond words. This was resurrection in its purest form, a soul reclaiming itself from the prison that had contained it. Titan walked the length of the barn, testing his newfound freedom, and with each step his confidence grew. His head rose higher, his stride lengthened, and something that might have been joy flickered across his features. When he reached the far wall, he turned and walked back to James, approaching with none of the fearful hesitation from earlier. The horse pressed his forehead against James's chest, the weight of it nearly knocking the older man backward, and James wrapped his arms around that massive head and held on tight. "Thank you," Titan seemed to say through that contact. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for understanding." And James, his face buried in the horse's mane, whispered back, "You're welcome. You're so welcome. You deserved this all along. You deserve to be free and safe and cared for, and I'm sorry it took so long for someone to realize that." They stood like that until James's legs started screaming in protest, until the physical discomfort forced him to step back and attend to more practical matters. "All right," he said, his voice still rough with emotion. "Now let's get you fed and watered properly, and then we need to clean these wounds." Titan's ears pricked forward at the word fed. some instinct telling him that good things were associated with that particular tone, and he followed James to where the grain bucket sat waiting. James poured grain into a feed trough he'd found in a corner of the barn, watching as Titan approached the food with the cautious hunger of someone who'd learned not to expect regular meals. The horse ate slowly at first, as if testing whether this bounty would be snatched away, but gradually his consumption became more natural, more confident. While Titan ate, James filled the water bucket from a spigot outside and hauled it back, setting it within easy reach. The simple act of watching Titan eat and drink, seeing him take sustenance without chains restricting his movement, filled James with a satisfaction he couldn't quite explain. It was the satisfaction of seeing a wrong righted, of knowing that his actions had directly improved another being's life in a tangible, immediate way. This was why he'd become a medic in the first place. Decades ago, this desire to fix what was broken, to ease suffering wherever he found it. Once Titan had eaten his fill and drunk deeply from the bucket, James retrieved the grooming supplies and the camping lantern. The sun was setting outside, painting the barn in long shadows, and he'd need good light to properly assess and treat Titan's injuries. He set up the lantern, its LED brightness flooding the space with artificial daylight, and began the careful work of examining every inch of the horse's body. The scars told a story James wished he couldn't read. Long marks across Titan's flank spoke of whips used with more force than training required. Circular burns suggested cigarettes deliberately pressed against skin. Poorly healed fractures in the bone structure of his legs indicated injuries that had never received proper veterinary care. Each mark was a chapter in a history of cruelty, a testament to the worst of what humans were capable of inflicting. James's hands trembled with rage as he worked, gently cleaning each wound with antiseptic, applying ointment to the raw areas where chains had rubbed, checking for signs of infection or deeper damage. Titan stood quietly through the examination, occasionally flinching when James touched a particularly tender spot, but never pulling away, never showing aggression despite the discomfort. It was as if the horse understood that this touch was different, that it came from a place of healing rather than harm. As James worked, he talked, filling the silence with gentle narration of what he was doing and why. This might sting a bit, he'd warned before applying antiseptic. I'm checking this leg for heat, which would mean infection. Your hooves need serious work. We'll get a farrier out here soon. The constant stream of explanation seemed to comfort Titan, giving him something to focus on besides the medical attention, building further trust through transparency and respect. By the time James finished his examination, full darkness had fallen outside, and his body ached from hours of careful work. But there was a satisfaction in that ache, the good kind of tired that came from meaningful labor rather than meaningless suffering. James spread his sleeping bag on a relatively clean patch of barn floor, creating a makeshift camp that would allow him to stay close to Titan through the night. He'd promised Mrs. Patterson he'd check in, and he pulled out his cell phone to find 3 missed calls from her and a text message demanding confirmation that he was still alive. James smiled at her persistence and dialed her number. She answered on the first ring, her relief palpable even through the phone. "Thank God," she breathed. "I was 5 minutes away from calling the sheriff." "I'm fine," James assured her, his voice warm with affection for her worry. "Better than fine, actually. I got the chains off and he's eating and drinking. We're going to spend the night here together just so he knows he's not alone." There was a long pause on the other end, and when Mrs. Patterson spoke again, her voice had softened considerably. "You're a good man, James Rutherford. That horse is lucky you found him." James glanced at Titan, who'd positioned himself nearby, close enough to keep James in sight, but far enough to maintain his own space. "I think maybe I'm the lucky one," James said quietly. "Sometimes helping someone else is exactly what we need to help ourselves." After ending the call with promises to check in again in the morning, James settled onto his sleeping bag and leaned back against the barn wall. His leg throbbed with familiar pain, but he'd learned long ago how to exist alongside discomfort without letting it dominate his experience. Titan watched him from across the small space, those red-rimmed eyes reflecting the lantern light, and James could see the exhaustion in every line of the horse's body. "You should sleep," James said softly. "You're safe now. I'm going to stay right here, and nothing's going to hurt you tonight." As if understanding the invitation, Titan took several steps closer and then, with a heavy sigh that seemed to carry years of weariness, lowered himself to the ground. The movement was careful, protective of his injured legs, but once down, the horse stretched out on his side, his large body relaxed in a way that spoke of trust James found humbling. Within minutes, Titan's breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep, and James watched the rise and fall of the horse's ribs with something approaching reverence. How long had it been since Titan felt safe enough to truly rest? How many nights had he stood, chained and vigilant, unable to let his guard down even for a moment? The fact that the horse could sleep now, could surrender to vulnerability in James's presence, felt like a gift of immeasurable value. James dimmed the lantern to a soft glow, enough to see by but not so bright as to disturb Titan's rest. His own eyes grew heavy, the events of the long day catching up with him, but he fought against sleep for a while longer, wanting to stand watch over this creature who'd stood watch alone for far too long. The barn settled into nighttime quiet, punctuated only by Titan's breathing and the distant sounds of crickets outside. Somewhere in the small hours of morning, James finally drifted off. His last conscious thought, a prayer of gratitude that he'd listened to his intuition, that he'd walked through those fairground gates and looked past fear to see truth. When he woke several hours later, stiff and sore from sleeping on concrete, the first thing he saw was Titan's face inches from his own, the horse having moved closer during the night to keep watch over the man who'd kept watch over him. "Morning, buddy," James croaked, his voice rough from sleep. Titan nickered softly, a sound James hadn't heard him make before, and the gentle greeting made his heart swell. He pushed himself upright, wincing as his body protested the movement, and began the process of getting his joints moving again. Titan watched with patient interest as James went through his morning stretches, the routine he'd developed to manage chronic pain, and something about the horse's steady presence made the discomfort easier to bear. James fed Titan another portion of grain and refilled the water bucket, pleased to see the horse eating with more enthusiasm than the previous evening. Color seemed to have returned to Titan's coat overnight, or perhaps it was just the morning light making everything look more hopeful. Either way, the horse standing before him looked more alive than the creature he'd first encountered just yesterday, and James allowed himself a moment of pride in that transformation. After ensuring Titan was settled, James ventured outside to call Dr. Sarah Henderson, the veterinarian Bill had recommended. She answered her cell phone with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency calls at odd hours. "Dr. Henderson," James began, "my name is James Rutherford. Bill Henderson suggested I call you about a horse that needs some specialized care." He explained the situation as concisely as possible, detailing Titan's physical condition, the evidence of long-term abuse, and the psychological trauma that would require as much attention as the physical wounds. Sarah Henderson listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment before responding. "I've heard about that horse," she said finally. "The whole county's been talking about him. Most people think he should be put down." James felt his jaw tighten. "And what do you think?" Sarah's response came quickly, decisively. "I think fear makes people cruel, and cruelty makes animals afraid, and it becomes a cycle that nobody wants to break. If you're willing to put in the work, Mr. Rutherford, I'm willing to help. I can be there this afternoon if that works for you." The relief that flooded through James was almost physical in its intensity. "That works perfectly," he said. "Thank you, Dr. Henderson. You have no idea what this means." Dr. Sarah Henderson arrived at the fairgrounds promptly at 2 that afternoon, driving a truck equipped with veterinary supplies and radiating the calm competence of someone who'd seen difficult cases before. She was younger than James expected, perhaps in her mid-30s, with intelligent eyes that assessed everything quickly without judgment. When she stepped into the barn and saw Titan for the first time, she stopped short, her professional mask slipping for just a moment to reveal genuine compassion. "Oh, you poor, magnificent creature," she breathed, approaching slowly with her hands visible. Titan, who'd tensed at the arrival of a stranger, relaxed slightly when he saw James step forward to greet her. The horse seemed to understand that anyone James welcomed was safe, and that trust transferred enough for him to allow Sarah's examination. She worked with the same gentle efficiency James had attempted, her trained hands finding injuries he'd missed, her experienced eye catching signs of malnutrition and stress that would take months to fully address. As Sarah worked, she talked to James about treatment plans, about the supplements Titan would need, about the importance of routine and patience in rebuilding a traumatized animal's sense of security. "He's got a long road ahead," she said honestly, running her hands down Titan's scarred legs. "But he's strong, and more importantly, he's got someone who cares. That makes all the difference." She prescribed medications, demonstrated proper wound care, and promised to return weekly to monitor his progress. Before leaving, Sarah turned to James with an expression of deep respect. "What you're doing here, it matters. Not just for this horse, but for what it says about choosing compassion over fear. The town needs to see that." James nodded, understanding that helping Titan meant more than just personal redemption. It meant challenging the narrative that labeled suffering as danger, that saw victims as threats, that chose containment over understanding. Word of James's work with Titan spread through Millbrook with the same speed the fearful stories had, but this time the narrative was different. People who'd sworn the horse was a killer now heard about how he followed James around the barn like a devoted companion, how he'd let the veterinarian examine him without incident, how those supposedly blood-red eyes were simply the result of crying and exhaustion. Some remained skeptical, convinced that the horse would eventually show his true violent nature, but others began to wonder if they'd been wrong. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been so frightened initially, became Titan's second most vocal defender after James. She brought carrots and apples to the fairgrounds, standing at a respectful distance while James fed them to Titan, marveling at the gentleness with which the massive horse took treats from James's palm. "He's beautiful," she admitted one afternoon, her earlier fear replaced by wonder. "I'm sorry I believed all those awful stories without questioning them." Tommy from the hardware store showed up one weekend, sheepish and curious, asking if he could see the horse everyone was talking about. James welcomed him, showed him how to approach Titan properly, and watched as the young man's face transformed from uncertainty to awe when the horse allowed him to stroke his neck. "I told everyone he was dangerous," Tommy said quietly, guilt heavy in his voice. "I never even tried to find out the truth." James placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Fear spreads faster than facts," he said. "But you're here now, willing to learn. That takes courage too." The comment seemed to lift some of Tommy's guilt, and when he left, he promised to set the record straight with everyone who'd heard his earlier warnings. Over the following weeks, Titan's transformation continued at a pace that seemed miraculous to those watching but felt appropriately gradual to James, who understood that true healing couldn't be rushed. The horse gained weight, his coat developing a healthy shine that made his black coloring look like polished stone. The wounds from the chains healed, leaving scars that would always tell part of his story but no longer caused pain. Most remarkably, Titan's eyes cleared, the redness fading as proper rest and care allowed his body to recover from chronic stress. But the deepest change was in Titan's spirit. The horse who'd been so shut down, so convinced that the world held only suffering, began to show curiosity about his surroundings. He'd investigate new objects James brought to the barn, would whinny in greeting when he heard James's truck approaching, would press close during grooming sessions as if soaking up the attention like sunlight. There was joy in him now, visible in the way he'd playfully toss his head or break into a spontaneous trot around the barn, reveling in his ability to move freely. James knew people were calling it a miracle, this transformation from chained monster to gentle giant, but he understood it differently. There was no miracle here, just the simple power of being seen, being understood, being given the safety to heal. Titan hadn't changed fundamentally. The goodness had always been there, buried under layers of trauma and fear. James had simply provided the space for that goodness to emerge again. On a clear morning, 3 months after their first meeting, James stood in the barn watching Titan graze peacefully from a pile of fresh hay, and he felt Margaret's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him. She would have loved this, loved seeing him pour his capacity for care into saving this magnificent creature. And perhaps, in saving Titan, he'd completed some circle of his own healing, had proven to himself that damage didn't have to be permanent, that with patience and love, even the most wounded souls could find their way back to trust. Titan looked up from his hay and walked over to James, resting his head against the man's chest in their now familiar greeting. And James, this wounded veteran who'd seen too much darkness, wrapped his arms around the horse who'd seen too much cruelty, and together they stood in the morning light, two survivors who'd found each other and chosen hope.